Hi, welcome back to the Feminist Frame, where we talk about popular media through a feminist lens. Today, we will be discussing The Disappearing Earth. It's a debut novel by Julia Phillips. The story starts on a rocky beach in the remote Russian peninsula of Kamchatka. Two young girls go missing, and the ensuing months brings about a police investigation that turns up nothing, while the community, initially rocked by the news, moves on with their daily lives. So, I don't know. This was an interesting read for me. It was not something I think I was expecting. I like the way that Julia Phillips plays with the setting and timeline and characters, because it's not your normal narrative. It starts with those missing girls chapter, and then each following chapter is from the perspective of a different character. So you move along in time while never really revisiting that same character's POV. What did you think about the narrative structure of the novel?
I really loved it. And I think the characterization of all of these women, because the people speaking are women from the peninsula, both native and Russians who've moved in, and there's lots of dynamics between that. But it reminded me of Homegoing, which uses the same narrative structure, and how much you would kind of mourn when a chapter was over because you wouldn't get to revisit that character again. And you're like, wait, no, I need more of them.
And and the way I read books, if you're anything like me and decide to just ignore the maps and character lists in the beginning, it took me a quarter through this book before I realized we weren't coming back around to any of these characters.
Well, you weren't going to be sure, right? Because there's different, the Game of Thrones of the world, and even Jodi Picoult, where you change perspectives, but then, you kind of go in a loop and you're like, oh, okay, now we're going to start with John again,
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure until quite a bit through, I think about 100 pages. And I was like, oh, we're not coming back.
Yeah.
Oh,
really,
damn.
liked her perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. And then some of them you were like, if this one could be over, that would be.
Yeah.
Only rarely did I think that, though.
That is true. There was some, I'm not over the moon with this novel as a whole. Don't get me wrong. I really did enjoy it, and I loved what she was doing. But I don't know. There's because some of those chapters didn't necessarily connect with me in a way. There's just some I could have take it or leave it.
Well, before we get into that, I wanted to say there's a lot of things I really love about this book that it does really well. I was pretty head over heels for this book, but I think one of my favorites of all isn't even just what it does, but what it does compared to everything else in the literary genre right now, which it's that it has such a fresh take on the missing girl, emphasis on girl, as so many of those books do, kind of story. And instead of constant tropes and stereotypes of unreliable women, we get to slowly learn this place and this geography and the clash of cultures. And it really focuses on the violence women face in this really desolate place in all of its forms. So,
That's actually a really good point. I don't even, after reading this book, I don't even think about it in necessarily that genre of missing women. There's a mystery thriller kind of element to it. And I think it's so different from all of those other books that you have said. I didn't even categorize it like that in my mind.
Yeah, because it's
a great point. It's so different.
Obliterates those kind of stereotypes of that. And I do love the way it shows kind of all of the different forms of violence that women have to deal with, specifically from men. You think of the cop in the chapter and just how he treats his wife, and it's mostly emotional abuse and insults. Or, the young women in December, where it's even if you're not with a man, that doesn't stop you from having to put up with their violence.
It was, so each of those POV chapters, I did also how she sort of enveloped you in that woman's world. So the whole book also isn't like about the investigation of these two missing girls. It's kind of like that's almost like the backdrop of the entire novel, that these, women in Kamchatka are living their lives, and that has happened. So it's kind of like they're following that news, or somebody they know is involved in the investigation. Somebody knows the witness of the case, little things like that kind of like pepper in there. But in a way, it almost becomes like a book of short stories too.
Yeah. They are very standalone. Like thinking of the second chapter, which like you were talking about, some have like less to do with the investigation than others. But thinking of the second chapter, which is like a young girl who her best friend has been told by her mother not to hang out with her anymore. And it's kind of, and so some people are closer to the case, and it does start to circle in much closer to the case as we go on throughout the book. So it's not like they're all just random. But in that one, it's less about the case at all as much as like this excuse to control women because violence against women is a threat, and young girls, it also becomes for some characters in this peninsula just an excuse to control women. So we get that with like the suspicious and controlling boyfriend and one of them, and with this girl who can't see her friend because she's not from the right part of town anymore. And that's where these things happen, according to the mother.
Yeah, so like controlling women, but like you mentioned, she's not from the right part of town. Like class plays a huge role in this novel as well.
Yeah, that was a thing too. Well, and not just class, but then also ethnicity and racial dynamics, because the native people in their own homeland are, very stereotyped against. And then there's also migrants that people are suspicious of. And it just reminds me of when in America every shooting is a white male and no one gives a shit about stereotyping that. And it's like, yeah.
And there is a little bit of, speaking of when folks, don't give a shit about this story, that story, this book also takes the two young girls that go missing are white Russians. And then later on, you find out about another case of a missing girl who was, a native, and her story was just kind of like dropped. So it kind of like plays, those two against each other. Like they're both tragic, but like one definitely like dominates the news cycle, and one, people come up with other excuses. Like the girl was a little older, she's in high school, they like essentially start like shaming her, saying she was promiscuous and whatnot, and like that, on top of the fact that she's a native woman, like are all kind of like reasons to drop the story, drop the investigation. Right. So it's interesting that they pair those two together as well.
She ran around and was up to no good. And that's even her own sister is convinced, and maybe that's out of like self-preservation, that she just like ran away. And everybody just accepts that she ran away, except for the mother and very few other characters. Yeah, but to your point about that like, caring about the two young white girls more than we care about the missing native girl, it is like also kind of about which women are sometimes listened to and who is not. And an emphasis on sometimes too, because, once the mother starts making too much noise, then they're like, well, we just need to quiet her. And then also there is a witness in the beginning who they eventually decide to just totally disregard because for whatever reason they decide she's not believable enough.
Right.
And it's just like this effort to like discredit women at all costs in their own violent stories it's very frustrating, but also she makes it beautiful to read.
Well, the violence too, there were things in this novel that I don't think I fully realized were still happening. Like if you recall, I actually asked you when this novel was supposed to take place. And that's because there's this one story of these two friends that kind of like come back together, and they're at a party, and they're two young women. They're at a party, they get to talking like outside by themselves or whatever. And you find out one of them is a lesbian and she's out in her city, and her friend is like, what are you doing? Like, you can't do that. Like, what happens. And there's this like frank discussion about like the violence against LGBTQ people. In Russia, and I like asked like when this took place, because surely that's not like this isn't present, and like it is in the present time, and like that kind of persecution is still happening, and it's just, I don't know, kind of like tore me apart for a moment, just being ignorant of the fact that is still happening.
Well, because you were asking about that, and I was like, oh yeah, Russia is a really horrible, horrible place to be gay, and there are still like assaults and beatings and people trying to lure people, with apps like Grindr and then to assault them. So if you want to learn more about that, there's a documentary called Hunted, The War Against Gays in Russia, that came out in 2014. And there's actually also a newer one about specifically the violence in Chechnya called Welcome to Chechnya, where they're even more kind of extreme threats that people face. So
I have heard about the ongoing issues in Chechnya, but I guess like on a whole, like I thought for, I don't know, whatever leap my mind made, I guess I was thinking like that was more of an isolated incident, and like there was like a hate group that like lived there or something. I don't know. But the fact that it was all over blew my mind, and it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And I mean, I don't know for sure, but I mean, they use cell phones in this. So it's definitely meant to be modern. She does a good job of, I think, like kind of weaving that into this larger story of like, yeah, there's a lot of issues for women. Whether or not you're with a man doesn't make you able to like escape the violence.
Well, and just another note on like timing and setting. Julia Phillips actually was living over in Kamchatka like rather recently. So that's kind of why she set this there. So she was studying over there and lived for, I don't know if it was like months or a couple years, but spent a considerable amount of time there. It's at least, within the past like decade. So I assume it is like present time.
Yeah, actually, she applied for a fellowship. She was interested in kind of this landscape and actually lived there for 2 years while researching the novel. And she gets a lot of credit. She did a lot of, particularly like with the even women, but researching and like just down to like the embroidery styles. I've seen people say like, actually, that's very legitimate. She did the work and did really good research for this. One thing we didn't really touch on, but why it's such an interesting setting is this is an extremely far east peninsula in Russia that's basically unreachable from the mainland because it's just such a wild, unforgiving topography. So the more northern you go in the peninsula, basically the less developed it is. And then you can't actually reach the mainland from this peninsula by driving. You have to go by ship or by air.
Yeah, because the point where it connects, it's like a mountainous and
so that's just kind of interesting, like how isolated these people are. And because I think you deal with like the loneliness specifically of some of these characters and like how isolating the place they're in elevates that so much. I love this quote that I had written down from one of the characters. She has loved Chega, his big heart, his bigger promises, but what truly brought joy in this life was a climbing salary, a full belly, and a firmly connected radiator pipe. I love that.
That's great
quote. And I think that's a really good snapshot of what some of these characters are dealing with.
And like, unfortunately, kind of brings things back to, we just talked about Little Women not long ago. Check out that podcast.
Yeah.
But, where marriage is, an economic proposition sometimes. And unfortunately, it sounds like that's part of it here too.
Yeah. I do really recommend this book. And if you've read this book and you really liked it, I would say kind of, I mentioned our